Hello, hello. It seems like my connection again is low, so I'm not sure if I'll be able to join this webinar in video. I might be going off and on.
We can hear you, Shanna, but we don't see you.
No, that's not a good thing, but I'm glad you can hear me. Nonetheless, welcome everyone to this webinar. My name, I hope you will see me in in a few minutes. My name is Shanna Brunt. I am the head of communications and marketing at Fairtrade, and today I will be leading this conversation. We'll be talking about the future of certifications. Big topic. We'll try to break it down. We'll be looking at the past. Where did we come from? What was good? What were the pitfalls? From there, we'll be looking at where we stand today, and moreover, we'll be looking at the future. How can technology help us move forward? I'll be having this conversation with these three fine gentlemen who will introduce themselves shortly. But first, let me explain that everyone can make their own contributions, share your thoughts, your ideas, your questions in the chat on the right. And my colleague Rafael is moderating this chat. Rafael, you there? I'm sure he is. We won't have a lot of time to answer your questions, but we'll pick about 3 or 4, and we answer these at the very end of the webinar. But don't worry, we will be answering all of the other questions in a blog post that we'll publish next week. So yeah, I see you already found the poll. It would be nice if everyone can share for us to have an idea who we're talking with. And that's it for me. I want to go to the speakers. Guys, if you can introduce yourselves, please keep it a bit short and introduce yourself by the means of these 2 questions. Who are you and what is it that you want to achieve in your work? Dan, you want to start?
Sure. Daan de Vries. I'm a freelance consultant for this year under the name of Chain Effects and on supply chain improvement and strategy for impact. What do you want to achieve? I guess my real motivation comes from protecting biodiversity and social equality. Thank you.
Nice. Sander?
So my name is Sander de Jong. I'm director of Fairfood. Happy to be in this webinar with Dan and Peter. So for those who don't know Fairfood yet, we at Fairfood feel the urge to rethink our food systems. That's also my personal aim in the work I do, because we believe that fair and sustainable food production and consumption is one of the most powerful drivers to end poverty and feed the future generations. And we see the last few years, we see there's a huge opportunity for smart technologies, bringing an exponential change to the way we live and work. And it has the potential to raise global income levels and improve the quality of life for people around the world. And this is what we want to. This trend is what we aim for, and at Fairfood we want to push for acceleration of these smart technologies for let's say for prosperity. So that's my aim in the work I do.
So much for being short, but I work at Fairfood, so I'm gonna, of course.
I'm sorry, Shanna. I will keep it shorter.
Peter?
Yeah, thanks, Shanna. My name is Peter Dangremont. I work as CEO for Fairtrade in the Netherlands. Some of you may know Fairtrade under another name, Stichting Max Havelaar, but it's actually entirely the same. What in my professional work I like to do is to contribute to the development of a more equitable trade system that allows farmers and workers to take control over their own lives, to invest in their own lives, to create decent livelihoods, to produce in a sustainable way with respect for human rights and environment.
Thanks.
Is that short enough?
Yeah, that was perfect. Let's get right to it. I want to first explore. I think it's very good to stand still what certifications have brought us, because I think it's quite a lot. So I want to explore the past. And with that, I want to know what was good, but I also want to know what were the pitfalls. And I think that Dan and Peter, you two will most likely have a good answer to that question.
Who do you want to go first? Should I kick it off?
Dan, go.
I think one important step that sometimes we forget, that already when producer groups are certified, it means that they have made a step up versus the average around them in terms of respecting human rights, in terms of applying environmental standards, and as well as improving their access to market. Becoming compliant is really a challenge for a lot of producer groups. So I think that is a very first step, what is good. Second is that serious certifiers, like we know, Rainforest Alliance, UTS, Fairtrade, members of ISEAL, they have developed a set of criteria, independent criteria, using multi-stakeholder settings to develop those criteria and provide assurance that there is compliance on these criteria. Lastly, I would like to highlight the fact that certifiers using a recognizable label actually provide the recognition for consumers who want to lead another life by buying more sustainable products, and also offering business an opportunity to differentiate them from other businesses that do not apply certain sustainability criteria in their sourcing.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah, I think in addition to that, you can say that if you really look back, one person once said certification is a kind of a language for people to speak through the supply chain. And it's really the standards at the beginning. People look at standards as very heavy bureaucratic things, but it's also really been a guidebook of good standards for farmers, certainly in the beginning. And it's kind of triggered and catalyzed a lot of programs to train farmers, to help farmers. And what I've also seen happening over the years is that it has also led to a lot more collaboration in the supply chain.
Yeah.
So, for instance, in West Africa, governments would not take NGOs seriously at all, like 10, 12, 15 years ago. And that's really changed a lot. And also, most of the trade companies, they were just pure traders, if you look at a decade back or 2 decades back. And now all of them have sustainability departments and experts and everything. So, and that is partly due to the whole certification movement, I'd say.
Yeah, thanks. Are there any pitfalls? I mean, I'm sure there are. Is it something you want to share? Something that we are learning from?
Yeah. Yeah. Should I pick up? I mean, I think there's one thing is it's been, there's been too high expectations, and you can of course talk about what's been behind that. Has that been over marketing of the initiatives themselves? Has it been hyped up expectations of people outside the organizations? In any case, I think it's been for quite some years. It's something that's been growing a lot, and so people think, hey, at least we have something which is working, and then they put all their bets on that horse basically. Yeah. And of course, it turns out that it's more complex than that, and you cannot just with this instrument, even if it has a lot of aspects, hope that it will solve all the problems, and that's become very clear. I think some of the shortcomings are it focuses on practices on the farm, and a lot of the issues are you cannot solve them only on the farm. There are a lot of aspects around it, like law and enforcement. And it also I would say that's probably one of the most important things. And then there's of course a lot of opportunistic behavior. I mean, when something grows, you can say certification is something that works really well if it works only with well-intentioned people. But if it goes mainstream, they're also not as well-intentioned people. Right. And then of course you have fraud and you have these kind of things, and that can also make it more complicated. Yeah.
Perhaps to build on that last point, Dan, I think what we also see as one of the pitfalls is that with the rising awareness around certification schemes, you also see a lot of greenwashing coming up. The fact which I think is also one of the pitfalls of certification right now is that it's all voluntary. Some organizations participate, and fortunately more and more participate, but definitely not all. And certainly when you look at a global scale, there is still a lot more volume in bananas, in coffee, in cocoa, in all kinds of commodities that is not certified than what is certified. That's one. Two is that there is, which in a way is good, but it also has its downsides. There is a sort of competition on how far the standards reach, which is good to keep the market alive, to challenge. But that's also the area where you see that some companies actually don't want to spend that much on sustainability, and they misuse more or less certification to greenwash their activities, which I think is an area of caution. One last point that I want to address is the misconception that Fairtrade is expensive, that sustainability is expensive. We've recently seen a piece of research published by Rotterdam School of Management, where actually one point was mentioned that companies could not make a viable business case on sustainability. Well, why is that? How is that possible? It is actually possible if you don't value human rights, if you don't value the environment. And that is, I think, what more and more certification schemes do, particularly what we do with a minimum price and a mandatory premium, is that we put a price tag on human rights, on income. And in regular trade, actually, we make profits at expense of other people, at the expense of the environment. And I think more and more people are starting to understand that that is no longer possible. And that's, I think, the big challenge to change that in trade. And probably later in this session, we will further dig into this.
Yeah, and I think that basically, to make that very practical, what you're saying is that if you look at the living income markups that are being calculated, or true price calculations, those are typically much higher than the certification premiums which are being paid indeed. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Peter and Dan, don't you also think it's, I mean, you touched the subject of greenwashing, the voluntarity around it, but isn't this also a pitfall that it has been so let's say the businesses that use certifications also tend to work with, several of them also tend to work with certifications to sort of outsource their responsibility. Whereas you, as a business, as a responsible business, you cannot really outsource your responsibility in a let's say a mark or a certification scheme. It is still your own responsibility.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but you have to start.
It does that also has to do something with the too high expectations that you need to meet.
I think that also has to do with that you cannot, if you provide something, a service or like certification, or you sell hammers, you can't always control what people use it for, right? So there are companies that use it very responsibly in the context of a great sustainability program, and there are people that kind of abuse it, but they don't literally abuse it. You can't really punish them or exclude them. But they're indeed not using it in a way that you would like it to be used. So I think that's also what's happening.
I think this is also an interesting bridge to one of the items on our agenda, which is around transparency. I think transparency in the supply chain actually helps to bring producers and manufacturers, brand owners, retailers closer together. The more transparent markets are, the easier it is for the producers to get in touch with the end buyers of the raw materials, as well as with the consumers. And by building that long-term relationship, I think the element of greenwashing, the element of outsourcing, what was your question, Sander? The element of outsourcing responsibility is no longer possible because you are involved. And
exactly.
I think also what we see amongst our licensees, our customers, we actually see hugely committed organizations. And what I find interesting is that organizations like Tony's, like Ben & Jerry's, that they actually are tremendously successful in the market. So where in the past people would frame sustainability and social mission-driven organizations as, well, that is a niche, that is small. Actually, what you see right now is that there is a mass pickup by consumers. They really embrace those brands. And I think it's that dynamic in the market that will make a lasting change also on the big conservative brands that don't move that fast.
And Peter, why am I now hearing this phrase certification and beyond a lot these days? Or actually, you also heard a more negative one, I think, beyond certification, but I like the certification and beyond a bit more. But
yeah. We're actually always fighting against beyond certification, because that's a little bit like throwing away the baby with the bathwater. I think everybody working in certification, certainly when you're around for a bit more than a couple of years, see that certification is not the ideal. Whatever is the ideal, I don't know. But certainly I think we cannot throw away what has been achieved so far by certification. And I think more and more the pressure that companies have nowadays on respecting human rights, on not eroding the environment, that pressure on companies actually makes them dig deeper. And on the one hand side, see that certification is a tool that can help them in certain areas. Yeah. And on the other hand, I think we're all, including the certification organizations, discovering that a lot more needs to be done. And that's why the and beyond is so very important. That's also one of the, hooking a little bit back on the pitfalls, one of the things we're struggling with as Fairtrade is that we don't only do certification. Actually, certification is one of our tools to make development at producer level happen. And it takes a lot more than just certification to make that development happen. You need to train farmers, you need to educate farmers, you need to bring the market end and the producers together. When you talk about estates, there's a lot of effort going into training of labor unions to take care of the negotiations around contracts. So there's so much more to the table than only certification.
Yeah.
And maybe just to mention, I think what's also interesting with this beyond certification thing, or and beyond, which indeed has been a term for the last 5 years or so. But so many companies actually made commitments around 2010 towards 2020. We forget that now, but this is actually the year that at some point Mars wanted to be 100% certified. Well, they didn't do that, and they decided already a couple of years ago that they would make that, because at some point it was like, hey, we can go for 100%, but it has to mean something. There has to be enough quality underneath it. And it means that we also need to put our attention on some other things. So I think that's...
It's very good that you mentioned that, Dan. I still have to explain to coffee farmers why the purchase of certified coffee is so low. And indeed, the same happened several years ago. The Dutch Coffee and Tea Association made massive commitments on the purchase of certified coffee. Didn't materialize at all. The farmers actually made investments. You know, these farmers that we all know earn way too little money, don't get right prices for their coffee. They actually invested anticipating the increased demand for certified coffee. And it just didn't take off. And that's, I think, where what we have to realize is that, you know, certification is only an enabler. You eventually need the market to purchase sustainably produced goods and pay a reasonable price for that, a fair price for that, a price that allows the producer to earn a decent income.
Yeah, true. I agree with that. But then there are also the other factors are, you need to, you know, once this gets a certain size as well, because of course in some sectors, and certainly cocoa, it's been growing very fast, although it's still the majority non-certified. But then you need to start mobilizing governments, which is a whole different, piece of things. And then another huge challenge in many of these supply chains is the demand from markets which are not certification or sustainability oriented so much yet. So big Asian markets and stuff like that. And where you also have producers saying, well, I have these Western buyers, but they come with this whole package of complicated requirements. I'd rather just sell to my Thai guys, and they don't ask any questions. Some Thai people do probably, but
I think you're beginning to get an answer around the beyond. That beyond actually is a wide spectrum that some people call the smart mix that you actually need to drive progress in supply chains.
Yeah.
I also think it's I think the whole concept of the voluntary schemes and the certifications have been built in the time prior to the whole digitalization and the digital revolution, and we now have the ability since a few years, to new transparency and collaboration models, to traceability, to the ability to manage big data. All these new sort of tools that come, that we can put in our toolkit to sustain international food supply chains it's massive. So I think that's also the beyond, and I do think that also the certifications in that sense have, and this is also why we're in this call, in this webinars, think together on how can we step up, how can we use these technologies, these developments, to also improve, let's say, the certifications, but also look into other ways of sustaining business. I think you're totally right, Peter, what you just said. It's just certification is just one of the tools, and the beyond is also on looking into, okay, what are the other tools available, such as traceability.
And that is actually bringing me to my next question, Sander. Thanks for that. Because of course we are going to be discussing technology and how it can help us forward, and I would very much like to hear from Peter and Dan how certifiers themselves are looking at new methodologies and new technologies, because I know that you are doing a lot with that. Maybe you can tell us a bit more.
Yeah, for us, technology is one of the ways to improve our proposition to the market. There's a lot of talk around blockchain. I would almost say, obviously, we're looking into blockchain. How can it help us? Where can it help us? But there's also a lot around digitalization of data, using big data. And in the end, it are all ways to reduce the cost, to improve the quality, to increase transparency, and also very much to reduce the burden on the supply chain, the administrative burden. The more you can use modern technology by linking databases, by using big data, you actually reduce the administrative burden and only make your proposition more and more interesting, because it's more effective and it's cheaper to use. So I actually see huge loads of areas where we can apply this new technology. It will be, I would say, learning on the go. At least that's how we approach it in Fairtrade. We're now in a large strategy process, and actually we've embraced running pilots on these new technologies. Just go and do it, find out what the pitfalls are, and take it step by step. Work with partners, because I think this is also an area where we as certifiers shouldn't pretend that we can, invent whatever somebody else already invented. I think this is more and more becoming to be an area where strategic partnerships will play an increasingly important role.
Yeah.
Right.
No, I mean, if I look at the experience, which of course I take much from Rainforest Alliance and which I didn't say in the intro, but we have technology has been part of the proposition for quite a while. I think that there's a couple of huge changes taking place. Of course, the whole digitalization and data, but especially the digitization in what we call the first mile. So really the penetration of phone technology, first phones, because we all think everyone has a smartphone, but actually in Africa or some places that's not the case. But at least phones, coverage. So there's this combination of course, trying to really digitize the core certification process, all the audits and everything, and also what you call the internal control system. So the way that cooperatives manage their certification, which has been very, very paper-based over the years, which is a huge waste of information. And using that information, digitizing that information, makes audits much more efficient, but especially also much more reliable, because then what you used to have, for instance, was random sampling of farmers to visit to see if they comply with a certification standard. And now you can actually start to use real data to see where risks are, and auditors can go to where the risks are. So it becomes really much more reliable. And then there's this whole addition of the more ubiquitous availability of good satellite data. So this whole remote sensing and cheaper and more granular satellite information, which helps you to identify, of course, deforestation, closeness to waterways, and putting that all together is really quite revolutionary.
Maybe to add to that is what I think we should not forget is the very low-hanging fruit at farm level, to use data and digital data as well, to make farmers understand the equation between inputs and outputs. Whenever I travel in Africa, I am surprised by the fact that most farmers I speak don't have a clue what the relationship is between their inputs and their outputs. And if you don't have a clue what that relationship is, how can you run an efficient farm? So I think using data, we quite often look at the very complex supply chain tracking and digitalization of supply chain contracts, et cetera, blockchains. But actually there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in helping farmers to collect the data that relates to their farm performance and to understand those data for the purpose of becoming a better farmer. And that, I think, is on the ground a really big revolution that can take place when all those millions and millions of smallholders that produce a big chunk of our daily food, of the world's daily food, start understanding how their farm actually works.
I'm by the way, my eye is falling on this comment on the chat in elephants in the room. So let's see if we can get to elephants. But anyway, yeah.
Well, one elephant is, I think, the pandemic. The reason why we're all sitting here behind our laptops, right? I want to know if there's anything that we're learning this year.
Yeah. I think one thing to mention here is that. To link first to the digitization point. So, traditionally, audits. I always like this kind of way of thinking. Audits always make use of observation, documentation, and interviews. So people sometimes think that if an audit is done, it's only a snapshot of that one day. Well, that's the case for the observations, but of course for the documentation and for the interviews, you get a view on something which is longer than that one day. However, with digital data, you start to get information from throughout the year. So you can start to get much more information, on a real-time basis, and the auditor can start to also track that and monitor that. Now, with the pandemic, people have not been able to go into the field, and that's a huge deal. We've seen that before with Ebola or with civil wars, so there are always these kind of upsetting events. But typically those were shorter lived, and then you could deal with it, like saying there's an exception and you get your certificate a year longer. But now it starts to become so wide and maybe so indefinitely long that this whole thing of getting data remotely will become much more and more important. So I think it's another push basically towards more digitization.
Yeah, it's actually pressure and force on innovation. There is a must to innovate there, to collect data in another way, to start developing self-auditing techniques. Means that you have to check those, deliver data in another way. So there, I think, is definitely an interesting area. I would like to highlight two other points. I think the differences are magnified more and more through this pandemic. And I mean differences in, for instance, access to the internet. You know, like we're so lucky that we can have this. Well, you had some problems, Chana, with your connection, but basically I think everybody can follow this conference. I've had so many conferences with colleagues from Africa where there's always on the African side of the line something stuttering. So they actually are in a way excluded to communication, how we experience communication here. That's already a very simple example. More, I think, looking at the resilience of producers, the producers in Africa and also in continents Asia and Latin America, their resilience is not that well developed. And it is a pandemic like this that puts a lot of stress on that. So I think the importance to build more resilience for farmers and workers in developing countries is so clear. It is also so clear that the existing economic systems actually don't do that. So we need to think harder how to change those systems, how to come up with systemic changes that enable this development of resilience to take place. And I think a lot of people have said this years and years ago, but now what you see with this pandemic, due to this pandemic, is that it's all magnified and it puts a big fat line under these areas that we really need to deliver on.
Yeah.
Exactly. There was this last summer. There was this interesting report from World Bank on the impacts of the economic impacts of the pandemic. They expect an additional 100 million people are under threat or poverty, and it also the report also shows that there is a huge potential for let's say to shift towards a more sustainable future. And they describe the 3 Ds. So it's about deconcentrate markets and supply chains, decentralize traceability, and disseminate data. And I think the first D, the deconcentrate markets and supply chains, I think it's also there lies huge potential also in this. Yeah, partly also because of this pandemic is to help smallholder farmers access, let's say, online trade markets to, for example, sell their trade directly to buyers online instead of local markets, because they cannot go to the local markets to sell their produce because of the lockdown. So simple examples such as these, how can technology help them? There's huge potential for that.
Yeah, and Sander, how do you see that relating to ownership of data? I think it's clear that producers have a lot of data that are interesting, but what is your idea on how these producers can actually turn this into an additional revenue stream for them and not for the trader?
I think that's there. You're touching a very important point here. That's also touches the whole discussion of data ownership and who's basically in charge of these platforms, right? These software platforms and you see many examples of that. These platforms are owned by private sector players, big companies, tech companies, and you also see good examples of that. Farmer cooperatives are owners of these platforms. The only problem is that you have to link supply and ask and demand, and the examples you see where let's say the smallholder farmers have their own digital cooperatives, they tend to have difficulties to find the market. And the other way around. So you see many startups, tech startups, blockchain startups here in the West, looking for smallholder farmers to help them on their platform. So it's a sort of a mismatch there. But I think there lies a solution, and here we come to the role our organization wants to play as a civil society organization. Is we are not, in that sense, we are not a market player. We want to be above markets. We want to enable the players in the market, the farmers and buyers and consumers, and we want to, let's say, help take away the concentration in the market, so that the buyers, the farmers themselves have more power.
Yeah, I think that's always been a huge wish, of course, to change the power balance in the supply chain. It is notoriously difficult. I think one of the, and I think it's also a question that I saw coming in the chat. There's this reality of price pressure, which makes this always very, very difficult. I think there is more awareness on that now, and there's also more awareness, I think, of the certification program. Certainly, I can speak for RA on that. It's clear that with only these rules and also with added technologies and blockchains and everything, you do not automatically change that. One of the things that that seems to be important is longer-term trade relationships and also longer-term contracts. I know it's something that Fairtrade definitely also has worked on for a long time. It was a promising sign recently that in the conversation between this is about the Dutch context, but the Dutch minister spoke with the supermarket sector here, and they also came to the same conclusion, and the supermarket sector promised to start working on longer contracts. And I think, there is always this pressure, but I think that's where the transparency starts to play a role. And I also was interested to hear about the living wage work of Fair Food, where you're also trying to make that more transparent. It's something that also the certifiers are working on, but many people are. And if it becomes clearer what you would actually need to pay, like also with the true price type of initiatives, then it's more likely that some people at least will.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I want to quickly go back to Peter's question, because I think there's a bit more to it than Sander said. Peter, you asked about data ownership. Because if we're moving forward and we are going to be discussing the added value of technology, then you're also talking about lots and lots of data. And there's opportunities there for farmers, but there's also dangers. Like if you're handing all of these data to the big data farms, then what is there for farmers, and how do they make sure they are in control?
Yeah, well, I think we already pick up some examples where farmers are out of control. Dan mentioned geotagging, geodata. We see in Côte d'Ivoire, in Ivory Coast, that actually the traders own the data that define the contours of farms and cooperatives. And when then the farmers want to switch to another trader because they have a better offer, they can't, because the trader requires the geotag data. But those data are owned by another trader. So it's a way to lock in the producer groups for a particular trader. This is just one very simple example where I think it's clear that there is strategic importance for the farmers to own those data. There's, I think the data can, when developed in the right way, help producers to eventually get a better price for their product. There is also a danger, especially when transparency is linked to the data. When you look at human rights due diligence, for instance, data around compliance and human rights or not can actually lead, and we also have quite a lot of examples there, particularly in Latin America, can lead to sort of cut and run behavior, where if certain human rights violations occur, the buyer actually would say, well, not my cup of tea, I'll go to another supplier. Where actually the idea is of this whole human rights due diligence process is that when human rights violations occur, you actually work together to fix them. and not to run away and find an alternative source. Obviously, if after many, many attempts you have not been able to fix it together, then there will be a moment of cutoff, but it's not the first starting point that you just shop around and find an alternative. So I think there are a lot of difficult dilemmas around data transparency, and a point that Dan just mentioned, long-term contracts, long-term commitments is one of the ways that you can prevent that cut and run and actually make sure that you're going to use the data in a responsible and sensible way to actually work on the development.
Yeah. We've been also thinking about this whole question of data ownership, and the question is, what is your goal with it? Is your goal control or sovereignty, with a bigger word, or portability? Like, indeed, if you switch buyers, can you take your data along? Or are you looking for monetization, direct monetization of the data? And if you're looking for monetization of the data, then one aspect is to do that, together with the physical product, which in a way, the certification premium is an example of, versus just selling the data separately. And then you get into the whole kind of concerns that we also have with the Facebooks and the Googles. But I think, so those are all issues. I do think that the whole portability and the direct control over data is the first step, and we have by far not achieved that with farmers. And I also think that it's something that legislation has to do a lot on. In some countries, this kind of privacy law is very developed, but it's mostly on security and privacy of data. But I think it should be quite mandatory that you can. It's like transparency of government. You should also, there should be transparency of buyers. If you want to have your dossier from a buyer, you should be able to get it and to show it to someone else.
Yeah, and I think it's also important that we start looking at acting on data. Just to give you an example, we've done a lot of work in West Africa to develop living income reference price based on all kinds of studies that we did. We developed a model how to get there, worked intensively with Tony's on that. And actually what you see is that if you want to enable farmers to earn a living income, a lot needs to be done on diversification of the farm, on increasing productivity, but also on payment to the farmers, the amount of money you pay per kilo of cocoa beans. And as a result of the outcomes of all those studies, we increased the minimum price with 20%, we increased the premium with 20%. Guess what happened? We lost 11% of volume in Côte d'Ivoire. That then brings me back to the point of this is all voluntary. Yeah. And as long as we don't put pressure there by law on how companies should act responsibly, it's just not going to happen. If the insight is very clear and there has been a lot of support for the living income model from the industry, from other stakeholders, but if you don't act along the line of that and actually run away if a price is increased, then we're never going to make a difference.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah. True.
Can technology, in the end, can it replace auditors?
Yeah, I think that's a good one. I mean, I think there we've seen a lot of that on the internet, of people hoping that now there's blockchain, so we don't need auditors anymore. It will all be fine. Sometimes, and I'm fine with blockchain does its certain things, but it's the old saying is crap in, crap out, and it could become immutable crap with the blockchain. So basically, you really need to use technology for what it can do, and what it can do with in the sense of auditing. You have to realize, of course, that a certificate is in many cases a right to supply. It's really for the whole year. It is for, in many supply chains, it's your license to supply. So to take away a license to supply on an automated process is very difficult. So typically what happens is that the technology provides you pointers of where issues are, and the auditors can then check more specifically on those issues. Peter, you probably have examples.
Yeah, definitely. We have examples for instance, in coffee, but it happens everywhere. What we call rogue trading, where actually on paper it looks like a nice contract, a nice execution of the contract. So in the blockchain, it would look like buyer A pays that amount to producer B, but in real life it's not. And we have cases where literally we had to use forensic accounting to demonstrate that criminal acts took place. And you will never see that on a blockchain. Nobody's going to feed that into a blockchain. But if somebody is literally held at gunpoint and somebody recollects part of the payment that is very nicely stated in the blockchain, you will not see that in the blockchain. And there's just, there's an awful lot going on in commodity trade that we cannot even dream of in terms of bad behavior, bad trading habits.
But don't you think, Peter, don't you think it does help in, be quicker and more responsive as supply chain actors to go to those places and find out what is happening, so you have more, let's say, without this digitalization and the help of decentralized ledger technologies such as blockchain, it has been, I would say, the work of the auditors has been more like shooting in shooting in tail.
No, I definitely
think
that's where I think call it the traditional certification can really benefit from these new technologies. You can point sharper. You can use big data analysis to actually find hotspots where things might go wrong, high risk areas, allocate your resources, your audit resources, but also your program support resources more to those areas to improve the situation there. So I think actually here, the partnership between the new technologies, whether it's blockchain or other technologies, and the traditional certification approach is actually probably a winning solution. So my cry would very much be to work together here, and I'm also keen to learn from you how on your system you actually work together or intend to start working together. And this is built also very much on certification and beyond. This is how we are going to design the beyond, and it's not instead of. And I think this also demonstrates that it is trying to find the right combinations of initiatives.
Yeah, that's actually leading to my next almost rhetoric question to Sander. Do people either use trace or certifiers, or do they use both?
So up till now, it's been sort of, to tell the truth, it has been two concepts that worked apart. But I also think that it's something that can benefit from each other. I mean, it is what we have been doing the last few years, working with blockchain-enabled technology to make supply chains more transparent, putting a spotlight on the local situation, having farmers become more informed, but also become, let's say, be able to raise their voice with the help of their handheld, and that is not only a smartphone; it can also be a Nokia phone. So, to give you an example, we are laying down this digital highway between producer, for small farmer, and consumer. There is a digital connection. It's a real connection there already. And on this highway, you can have any claims you want to, let's say, attach to this product. Also claims from certification organizations. On top of that, I think that the technology has the potential to enable farmers, for example, if there's human rights violation, if these farmers don't get paid, or they have this gun at their head, or they see there's child labor on the fields, they are now able to anonymously raise their voice, have their hand held as their, let's say, their extra means to make sure that what happens is also, being followed up by. Examples such as these I think, have huge potential where it can work together. We have not done that before because it's fairly new, but yeah, we're very much looking forward to run such projects such as these. Yeah.
Dan?
No, I think that's very interesting. The sort of the method for grievances by mobile technology and stuff. I think that's relatively untapped and has a lot.
Especially when it comes to food workers, right? I mean, the certifications have been fairly successful in towards the small farmers, but the food workers have not yet been able to really raise their voice and talk about their income situation, for example. I think there's a lot of potential still to be tapped from to also help the workers in the future, nearby future.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you, Sander. I also want to highlight that already also a lot of work has been done there, particularly in training local unions, but also in auditing techniques there. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't know. That there are huge differences in the way certifiers audit. Do you audit on-site? Do you audit off-site? That's already a massive difference. And that's where you need to dig deep into the technicalities of how organizations work to understand the way they collect data and then also come up with a judgment on the quality of those data collected. Obviously, when you collect data on farm, the owner of the farm can always have a sneak over the shoulder or a microphone somewhere planted. That's not really a safe environment to do an interview.
No. And then it would help to, for example, send some questions to the Nokia phone.
Yes, definitely.
These farmers, so these workers can answer in their safe environment, can answer questions.
And I think actually this is a really interesting aspect, because then you can start thinking in different concepts, because then every worker on an estate actually is a sort of an auditor.
Exactly.
They can be the eyes and the ears. That comes to registration of non-compliances, but it can actually also help to change behaviors. I think some of you might recall that we've had some challenges on some flower estates where the workers weren't wearing face protection masks. They weren't wearing them not because they don't understand that they need to protect themselves. So if other workers then start spotting that and actually not only report it, but also address that to their co-workers, then you're actually going to change some behavior on those farms, which is, I think, a very interesting aspect of using the eyes of all the workers on a farm.
Yeah. I want to get to a question from the audience. This one is from Karin Kleindoy. How do we digitize real-time data that can accelerate supply chain transparency in ways that are more collaborative, less resource-intensive, and more decision-useful? Not only corporate-driven, but farmers having some control over parts of the data generation.
It's quite a long question. Can you repeat it? Because
that's a good question, Karen. Obviously, I know Karen from Solidaridad.
It's right on the top of the chat. How do we democratize real-time data that can accelerate supply chain transparency in ways that are more collaborative, less resource-intensive, and more decision-useful?
So it's a lot about democratization of data.
Yeah,
exactly, and the decentralization.
I think some of the things we were just talking about, that is kind of democratization, right? That there's much more. The sources are much more also spread out, and then the question is also whether the usage is spread out. So the question is a bit what you mean with democratization, but
I think it also touches Peter's point. It's the whole. What we don't want with the whole data farming, if you would call it like that, is that again this data is controlled by certain players that benefit from it, and not necessarily the farmers themselves. So in that sense, I think that there's a role for CSOs such as ours to play there, and the technology, the way how we design the technology and the infrastructure and the governance in a way that the farmers benefit from it and not are locked in any contract or in any way. I think that's the most important.
Yeah, and I think there what is really important is to keep it simple. I always like the example of M-Pesa, which is a payment system that's built on the platform of a Nokia 6510 or 6610, whatever it is, one of those refrigerator telephones. It's a very simple cell phone protocol that is available across Africa. That's why, in Kenya, more than 90% of adults use M-Pesa. By democratizing data, you need to be aware of this, that the data are literally accessible by everyone, which means that you use simple data protocols. So that's, I think, a very important one. I think it's also important that when you talk about democratization, that we link the outer ends of a supply chain, because democratization of data actually means that consumers, you and I, have access to what is happening in the supply chain. And that means that we can raise our voice. If we don't know, we can't raise our voice. And this is where I think the importance of consumers, maybe I should say citizens, and smaller pockets of active citizens comes in place. You know, there is a growing group of primarily, I would say, youngsters that are very committed to a sustainable planet, both from an environmental as from a human aspect. But you actually need the information to make a real point, to put pressure on politicians, on policymakers, and to even sometimes claim. Look at what Urgenda did with their lawsuit against the Dutch government. That is groundbreaking. You need data to do that. You need data to win those kind of lawsuits. And I think that's what democratization of data can do. I also want to raise a point of caution, because we have to respect the privacy of the producers. And we also have to respect the fact that when we talk about data, when we talk about, for instance, all the data that you need to collect in the context of human rights due diligence, is a massive extra admin burden on producers. And I have so many discussions with producers system, they say, and who's going to pay for all those hours?
Right.
So we've got to find a way to make the market absorb those costs that they currently bypass. A lot of profits are made on exploitation, on environmental degradation, and we've got to find a way to stop that, to make the transaction more inclusive.
Yeah. And that's maybe to tap on that. I think we briefly discussed the voluntary initiative. These initiatives are still voluntary. And I think we also need to think on the more mandatory steps to take.
Yep.
So,
definitely.
or to have, to have organizations be more follow legislation. So to ensure that companies tackle these issues, and it's not that in this case the producer should not pay for this extra burden. It should come from the market, and the market should pay for it.
I think
and it's very good that
you're out there, Peter. It's actually 6 o'clock, so that's actually the end of this webinar. And I do, Sander, really like that you made that point. Just as a final point, I mean, we touched upon it, but I think that in the end we all agree on 2 things. One, the fact that this is a matter of collaboration, and to the fact you just mentioned that we need legislation to get where we want to get. I think we could talk another hour about both of these things, but I have to stop you right here. I want to thank you three for being here. I want to thank everyone who's watching for being here. We will get back. I'm sorry, we only had the time for one question. We will get back to all the other questions in a blog post, as I just said. I will send an email once that one is live. Thanks, and enjoy your evening, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.